Fine Arts and Music, as it then was, at UEA. After 3 years as Dean of the school, and following Peter Lasker's departure to be Director of the Courtauld Institute in London, Andrew was appointed Professor of Visual Arts here. He died suddenly and tragically in 1995, having been instrumental in transforming the school from its initial focus on European art to its current broader global remit. For his own research and teaching, Andrew, however, remained committed to the arts and architecture of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The annual lecture that bears his name usually takes as its subject the work of an artist or themes close to Andrew's own interests. Among those themes were the reputation of artists and the roles of elite patronage in establishing the public's taste for art. Tonight's lecture on the cult of Raphael in Britain is thus doubly appropriate, and Sandy is going to say a few more words of introduction.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and good evening, everyone. To those who don't know me, I'm Sandy Heslop, Professor of Visual Arts and School of Art Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Brendan Cassidy from the University of St Andrews. Before I do, could I just say to myself and everyone else to turn off the mobile phones? And to say that there are 2 fire exits at the back. The one on the right, you have to turn the handle in order to get through it. But I'm sure there won't be any emergencies. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome and introduce Brendan Cassidy, who has been at St Andrews since the mid-90s, where he's now Professor of Art History. Before that, he was Director of the Index of Christian Art at Princeton in the United States. Before that, at the Warbird, but he began his academic career doing a chemistry degree. So this conversion to art history is something that we should be enormously grateful for. Brendan is a scholar with an incredibly wide reach, not just into the sciences, but across art history from the early Middle Ages to the 18th and 19th centuries. And he's written very widely on medieval art, including his wonderful book of 2007, Politics, Civic Ideals, and Sculpture in Italy, 1240 to 1400, and most recently, in the 18th century, on the life and letters of Gavin Hamilton. And this is part of Brendan Cassidy's interest in the Grand Tour and in collecting, in what gets into country houses, and the establishment of artists' reputations and dealing and so on. And it's about that that he's going to speak to us this evening on the cult of Raphael in Britain from the Tudors to the Victorians.
Terribly impressed that Sandy could remember the title of my book. My children have christened it Bollocks, Rupture and Civic Partnerships. Italy, 1249 to 1250.
So we should keep lights on, shall we? Oh, sorry, yes. Would people prefer the 1930s cinema experience with the lights off, or yes?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah?
Yep.
Yes.
Well, I'm delighted to have been asked to give this talk in lecture in memory of Andrew Martindale. I met Andrew several times when I was a student, and I was doing my PhD, and I remember him as being extremely helpful, extremely generous with his time, and very, very witty. He was also a very fine scholar. And his work is still required reading on my courses in the Trecento. Now, I considered talking on the Trecento this evening, but I'm working on such rather grim topics, politics and hell, that I thought I'd better choose something more palatable for the hour before dinner. So I'm going to talk about this man. I'm not going to talk about his art as such, but about the way he was perceived in Britain and the impact he had on British art up until the middle of the 19th century. Now, when I suggested to Sandy this is a subject I would talk about, I wasn't quite prepared for the amount of material I found, so what I'm going to offer tonight is merely a survey, or gleanings, as the Victorians might have put it, a sort of gallimaufry. I think it's fair to say that today Raphael would probably be crowded out of the public's top 20 by the likes of Michelangelo, Leonardo, Monet, Van Gogh, and a host of others. But for over 300 years after his death, he was consistently and almost universally admired as the supreme painter. When Napoleon drew up his list of treasures to be appropriated from the countries he conquered, at the top of his list were paintings by Raphael. 17 were looted from Italy, 5 were taken from Spain. And the jewel in the crown of the new Musée Napoleon was the Transfiguration. This, not Leonardo's Mona Lisa nor Michelangelo's David, but this was the iconic image of European art for, as I say, several centuries. Monumental in scale, illustrates a passage from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Christ goes with the apostles, Peter, James and John, to a high mountain where they see him transfigured. His face shines like the sun, his robe becomes white like light, and a voice from heaven announces, "This is my beloved Son," at which the apostles fall to the ground in fear. In the lower part of the picture is the incident that follows the Transfiguration in the Gospel, in which Christ is asked to heal a lunatic boy, the apostles having failed to do so because of their lack of faith. Now, this was the painter's last work, and it's almost ignored today in the Vatican Museum by the crowds who queue to see Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. And so it's perhaps difficult to appreciate the impact that it once had. Jonathan Richardson, portrait painter and probably England's first art historian, declared, "Is this not the principal single work that he ever gave to the world, and which perhaps has ever been made? The subject is one of the most magnificent which could have occupied the human imagination. It's by the greatest master of all time." There were copies of it all over Europe, in Scottish castles and in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Now, Richardson's is only one of hundreds of voices who have left records of their raptures on seeing Raphael. Now, a lot of this eulogizing is repetitive, of course, but the range and the type of admirers are quite extraordinary. Nietzsche, for example, drew upon the Transfiguration with its compositional and episodic divide to illustrate his theory about the Apollonian and Dionysian sides of human nature. Other paintings could also elicit extravagant responses. Hegel deeply admired the Sistine Madonna, a painting to which George Eliot also responded with almost visceral intensity. In a letter, she recorded her sensations before the painting. A sort of awe, as if I were suddenly in the living presence of some glorious being, made my heart swell too much for me to remain comfortably, and we hurried out of the room. So who was this artist who could move people so profoundly? In a follows the most potted biographies. He was born in Urbino in 1783, and he was first trained by his father before being apprenticed to Perugino, whose style he adopted in his early works, as you can see. In 1504, he went to Florence and saw the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and under their influence, his style changed radically. Compositions became more complex, there's a new softness in the painting, colours are richer, denser, his art becomes altogether more ambitious. In 1508, he travels to Rome, where Pope Julius II employed him to decorate new rooms in the Vatican. In the stanza della Segnatura, he painted a series of frescoes illustrating various branches of thought and learning. The school of Athens representing philosophy being perhaps the most famous. By the time he had completed these, he was 26, 27. He was already celebrated, and he was courted by cardinals, kings and princes, all of whom wanted work from him. Increasingly, he came to rely on his workshop to expedite the commissions that flooded in. And scholars are continuing to argue over which of the late works may have been painted by Raphael's own hand. He died in 1520, aged only 37, which incidentally is a dangerous age for great artists. Mozart and Van Gogh both went to that age. So if you have aspirations in that direction, stay in bed when you're 37. Now, Giorgio Vasari's fulsome life of Raphael and his lives of the artists have come to be accepted as the official biography, as it were. Although Michelangelo is Vasari's principal hero, Raphael came in a good second. And it's his character as much as his art that was appealing. In Raphael, Vasari wrote, "The rarest gifts were combined with such grace, diligence, beauty, modesty and good character, and those who possess such gifts are not mere men, but rather mortal gods." But it was the Raphael of Vasari who would dominate English writing on the artist. His biography would be selectively mined to support various agendas. His description of Raphael as a gentleman scholar who did not live like a painter but as a prince had inevitable appeal for artists. For they had long sought to be recognized as the social equals of the polite classes and to have their work appreciated as an intellectual and scholarly endeavour rather than merely an exercise in manual skill. So as a cultural icon, an almost quasi-legendary figure, Raphael took on multiple significations. And these could be made use of by those with the power to do so. For example, in arguments over the need for a national or royal academy to train British artists, Raphael was recruited to the pro-academy side. According to Vasari, Raphael had reached perfection through hard work and training. Unlike Michelangelo, whose talent, it was implied, had been something innate, and something divine almost. To purge himself of his hard, dry, youthful style, Raphael had studied Leonardo and Michelangelo, says Vasari. He had taken lessons from Fra Bartolomeo, and he'd examined the bodies of the living and of the dead. And, says Vasari, he had, and I quote, combined particulars from the best things of other masters to form his own individual style. Sir Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy, in his discourses delivered to students of the RA, summed up Raphael's artistic qualities. The excellency of this extraordinary man lay in the propriety, beauty, and majesty of his characters, and, most notably, his skillful accommodation of others and other men's conceptions to his own purpose. Raphael was the ideal academician. But what would the British have known of Raphael's art? What might we have seen? Well, in the 16th century, probably very little. This little panel with St. George and the Dragon, commissioned by the Duke of Urbino in 1507 to commemorate being made a Knight of the Garter by King Henry VII, may have been the first painting by Raphael to arrive in England, but it was probably here only in the early 17th century. Before that, in 1542, Henry VIII had acquired a set of the tapestries that Raphael had designed for the Sistine Chapel. And here you see them in the lower, the tapestries in place in the Sistine Chapel. But the real history of Raphael in England begins with Charles I. After a state visit to Madrid in 1623, when he saw the treasures that had been amassed by the Spanish kings, Charles embarked on his own omnivorous collecting and accumulated the greatest collections of pictures ever assembled in Britain, including this lovely Holy Family, which he hung in his private lodging room. From Genoa, he bought 7 cartoons for full-scale drawings that Raphael had made as designs for the Sistine tapestries already mentioned. King Charles's courtiers were almost as acquisitive. The Marquis of Hamilton, for example, had some 600 pictures, including a St. Margaret by Raphael. In London then, in the 1640s, were to be found the most extraordinary treasures. Alas, their stay was only brief. Charles I disputed with Parliament over the division of powers, erupted into civil war between royalists and parliamentarians. In 1646, the king was captured and in 1649 beheaded. The victors, solidly Protestant and puritanical in their tastes, sold off the late king's goods for the benefits of the people. Buyers descended in London from all over Europe. The Spanish ambassador could barely conceal his excitement on acquiring this picture for King Philip IV. This was by far the most expensive picture in the auction. And he writes, "Thanks to God, I've bought the large Raphael, considered the finest painting in the world. And it would be christened the Pearl of the Spanish Royal Collection." The Marquis of Hamilton's St. Margaret, here she is here, ended up in the hands of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm in Brussels, seen here in this Teniers painting. Now the cartoons, to which I'll return, weren't sold, and we don't know why. With the restoration of the monarchy, English enthusiasm for art and collecting revived. Thousands of Britons descended on Italy on their grand tours. And those who had the money, lots of money, wanted to buy Raphaels. Raphaels were very few and far between. And those that were acquired, did arrive in England, seem scarcely to have been known about. The Ansidei altarpiece was smuggled out of Italy by the Scots dealer Colin Morrison, who then sold it to the Duke of Marlborough. When it was displayed at Blenheim, it seems to have attracted very little attention, because perhaps it wasn't Raphael's early dry style, as Vasari had described it. In Zoffany's wonderful painting of English visitors to the Uffizi in Florence in the 1770s, we see a crowd of Englishmen admiring the treasures of the Medici, among which are 5 Raphaels. Now these, when I made these slides, they look beautiful on my computer. They are rather vigorous. Anyway, here's Zoffany over here. There he is. He's present and he's holding a Madonna that he bought in 1772 from the Nicolini family and that he sold to Earl Cowper, who also bought this lovely picture of the Virgin Mary. But since Cowper, for a long time in Florence, lived for a long time in Florence, these pictures again are hardly known in England. This lovely image is now being provided free by the National Gallery in Washington, God bless them. They've decided no longer to charge. After the French Revolution, French aristocrats sold off their pictures before the revolutionaries could get hold of them. And wonderful paintings like this were acquired by British collectors. So Raphael from the 1720s became more familiar to British travellers and art lovers. But what effect did he have on artists? Well, it's hard to tell. With French artists, it's relatively straightforward to chart a line of descent from Raphael through Poussin and other artists attached to the French Academy, and then into the 19th century. But in English art, the picture is much less clear, and for one major reason. And that is, the kind of pictures that Raphael painted were not painted in England. There was little demand for religious paintings because of the suspicion of popery and idolatry that hung over them. Historical and mythological painting, which were judged the most intellectually demanding, and which the English art establishment tried to foster a taste for, also foundered because English people just would not buy history pictures. What the British wanted were portraits. Portraits of themselves, of their houses, of their horses, and of their dogs. Reynolds estimated that there were about 800 painters in London in his time, most of whom were portrait painters. Hogarth put this addiction down to British vanity and selfishness. and lamented the lack of state or church patronage that might have allowed wider scope for artist talents. Nevertheless, for well over a century, from about 1720, and despite the dominance of portraiture, Raphael infiltrates British painting in several ways. And the pictures to which most artists often refer are the cartoons, which in the 1690s had been placed in a gallery at Hampton Court, designed by Christopher Wren. For many Englishmen, the cartoons represented the very pinnacle of art. George Turnbull, in his treatise on ancient painting of 1740, said, "They ennobled the mind, inflamed the imagination, lit up the understanding, and provided a limitless supply of true and great thoughts." Reynolds summed up Raphael's achievement, and I quote, "He has drawn the apostles with great nobleness. He has given them as much dignity as the human figure is capable of receiving." Another Englishman, a clergyman in 1831, proclaimed, and I quote again, "No attentive observer ever turned from them without deriving moral and intellectual improvement. They offered a glimpse of paradise." Now, the fact that these treasures were in England was a source of immense satisfaction, because this proud nation, among the richest in Europe, militarily powerful, with a strong intellectual, scientific, and literary tradition, had an inferiority complex where art was concerned. It was the one area in which the English felt themselves lacking when compared to France and Italy. And the cartoons helped to raise British self-esteem. Jonathan Richardson judged the cartoons superior to Raphael's paintings in the Vatican. And when his book was translated into French, it caused an uproar on the continent. He was ridiculed for his ignorance and his wrong-headed chauvinism. And there was indeed a patriotic element to Richardson's pronouncements. For owning the cartoons meant that the English were not culturally disadvantaged when compared to France. They were endlessly copied in drawings, paintings, and prints. They were indeed a school for aspiring artists and established masters. And they served also as illustrations in drawing manuals. Here's a drawing manual that was published in London in 1759. And the author has indexed the various expressions and emotions to be found in the figures in the cartoons. So if an artist, for example, wanted to represent awe or attention, he was directed to study Raphael's charge to St. Peter. So you went to the plate, and over there you found a little drawing after the head of St. Peter, which if you copied would give you a figure that expressed awe or attention. When Hogarth was commissioned in 1747 to provide a painting for the chapel of Lincoln's Inn, he painted an appropriate judicial subject drawn from the Acts of the Apostles, in which the corrupt Judge Felix here adjudicates between St. Paul and his accuser Tertullus. Now, the style of this extremely large painting is very much Hogarth's own, incorporating several of his lines of beauty, like this here, for example. But the models on which he draws are taken from Raphael. He shows a debt to two of the cartoons. His figure of St. Paul seems based on this Paul preaching in Athens, and the figure of Felix is probably drawn from this figure in the blinding of Olympus. And when in the 1840s and the 1850s there was the first concerted attempt to establish a British school of history painting, the decoration of the Houses of Parliament, the first director of the National Gallery, Charles Locke Eastlake, suggested that Raphael's Vatican paintings were, and I quote, as good a model as any painter employed could contemplate. And several of the artists involved agreed. William Dyce's vision of Sir Galahad of the 1840s is clearly influenced by Raphael's Disputa, though probably by a roundabout route. But this image of Christ seems fairly certainly from here. And other figures, like Galahad himself, similar to this figure down here. Now, in cases like these, I think we can safely assume that the quotations from Raphael were supposed to be recognized. They dignified the later painting by association with its great Renaissance predecessor. On the viewer's side, there would have been a certain gratification in recognizing the references. But quotations from Raphael were often done at one or more removes. Artists frequently relied on prints of Raphael's work for ideas. And the prints, of course, bore the style of the printmaker. Etty's Judgment of Paris was drawn from Marcantonio's engraving after Raphael. And Marcantonio's Raphael tends to be a little more mannered than the work of the real Raphael. And poor Raphael was often rather ill-served by his engravings. And so the imagined Raphael could take various forms. But the whole business of quotation was fraught in other ways. Joshua Reynolds found a way to accommodate his own taste for a kind of grand historical art with the predilection of patrons for portraits. He found an accommodation between them, because he produced what he called portraits in the historical style, some of which had allegorical or historical connotations, and they made reference to old masters. The vigorous, twisted pose of Colonel Tarleton here, with his raised leg and his arm coming across his body, is curiously similar to that of the nymph Galatea from Raphael's Farnesina frescoes. And it may be also that the story of Galatea, who triumphed over the Cyclops' amorous advances, had resonances with Tarleton's own stormy love life at the time. Reynolds' portrait of the Crewe sisters, he seems to have devised from two figures that he cut and pasted and that figure there, and brought them together to give us the Crew Sisters. Now, in pictures like this, Reynolds was doing exactly what he advised the students of the Royal Academy to do. Consider, he tells them, how a Michelangelo or Raphael would have treated the subject. He then advises them to look to the old masters for ideas, but to change the purpose of the figure without changing the attitude. For that is what Raphael himself had done by skillfully accommodating other men's conceptions to his own purpose. And, as if to deflect the accusations of plagiarism that were directed at him, Reynolds also remarked that Raphael might borrow where he pleased without loss of credit. Now, Reynolds spoke of imitating for the purposes of invention. But Nathaniel Hone considered it plagiarism. And his conjurer is a veiled allusion to Reynolds' practices. And this picture was rejected for exhibition by the Royal Academy in 1775, once its subject was understood. Now what we see is the old magician waving his wand over a cascade of old master prints and transmuting them into a framed and finished painting that emerges from the smoke and flames of this cauldron of the imagination. Now, Nathaniel Hone, in his choice of prints, did a very good job in identifying the sources of some of Reynolds' pictures. Reynolds' Duchess of Marlborough is clearly based on that print there. And that print there was taken from this fresco here by Michelangelo. And Raphael's St. Margaret, you see again, there's the print. Owen has identified the print here. May well have been the source for this portrait of Mrs. Hale as Rosny in 1766. Now in 1973, the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote a dense little book called The Anxiety of Influence, a Theory of Poetry. Now, the book enjoyed some acclaim at the time. I don't know if anyone reads it anymore. I have recently, and it is dense. Anyway, Bloom's thesis was that strong poets misread one another or misread their precursors in order to clear imaginative space for themselves. Weaker talents, he says, idealize, but figures of capable imagination appropriate for themselves. Now Reynolds presumably would have considered himself an imaginative appropriator. But appropriation, according to Bloom, brings with it anxiety, since the strong poet then feels indebted. Indebted because he didn't do it himself. Oscar Wilde's words, to quote, he becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that hasn't been written for him. Now, Raphael certainly induced anxiety in artists, if not necessarily in the ways that Bloom described. His assumed perfection, of course, was something to strive for, but it was also a burden. Reynolds, no doubt thinking that he was being helpful, advised students that when they were painting, they should do so with Raphael or Michelangelo in mind, and imagine that one or other of them would be along shortly to critique their work. Benjamin Robert Hayden, in 1815, was stricken by the realization that at his age, Raphael had already completed the Vatican stanza. Now, Turner, who in Bloom's terms would undoubtedly be classed as a strong artist, drew on the example of Raphael to create a painting with all the iconographic and elusive density of a Renaissance fresco. In 1820, on the 300th anniversary of Raphael's death, Turner exhibited one of his largest paintings at the Royal Academy. It commemorated his visit to Italy in 1819, and it paid homage to his great precursor. So here we see Raphael and his mistress, standing under one of the great arches of the Vatican loggia. The balcony overlooks St. Peter's Square and provides a view far into the distance. Raphael appears lost in thought as he looks towards the ceiling of the loggia in which he's been painting. Now, this picture by Turner was a puzzle to his contemporaries, and it remains a puzzle today. It may be an example of the kind of imaginative history painting that was recommended at the time. By reference to the past, the artist alluded to concerns that were relevant to the present. Now, the anachronisms in Turner's picture, I think, are the clues. He's included, in his view of St. Peter's Square, he's included Bernini's 17th century colonnade, therefore after the time of Raphael. And he's also put in a landscape by Claude among the works of art as well. Here we see it there. Among the other works of art we see there is an antique river god and Raphael's Madonna della Sedia, right in the center. On the ceiling up here, the creation of Eve is highlighted. It's seen brighter than the other images. And Raphael himself is holding a picture of Noah instructing the ark. Now, Turner never did explain what this painting was all about, and there have been various hypotheses. But it would seem to be a meditation on history, beginning with Genesis, the creation of Eve, and the survival of the human race through Noah and the ark, and also the major and continuous role that Rome played in that history, in the history of civilization, both as a pagan empire and then the center of Christianity. And there may be allusions to the historical role of the artist. Noah's Ark, for example, was recognized as an architectural undertaking. There may also be references to the character of Raphael, who, although he enjoyed his worldly pleasures, suggested by his bosomy girlfriend, could also paint some of the most tender and most spiritually uplifting images of the Virgin Mary. And there may be an autobiographical element in the picture, with Turner identifying himself as a successor of the great master, and also Claude, whom Turner equally admired. Now in this painting, Turner responded to Raphael in his own high art terms. In this one, the relationship is something less respectful, more familiar. For in true British fashion, even Raphael was up for a joke. Now this is Reynolds' parody of the School of Athens. Reynolds was in Italy between 1750 and 1752. And this painting caricatures the British in Rome, their pretensions to knowledge and culture, their lack of grace, their general bad behaviour. The British, incidentally, had a reputation for drunkenness, even back in the 18th. And Reynolds does this with reference to the grandest of all history paintings in the School of Athens. The classical setting of Raphael's picture, I'll show you the parody in a minute. The classical setting of Raphael's fresco becomes a northern Gothic structure. Raphael's Plato, the supreme intellectual, extremely learned man, becomes the corpulent Irishman Joseph Leeson, who seems to be trying to identify a coin or a gem that he's holding in his hand. He's got his magnifying glass out. He seems to be asking his friend to look it up in the catalogue. For the group around Pythagoras over here, Pythagoras is a group of students. He's talking about mathematics, harmony and music. In Reynolds' picture, we have a makeshift trio of flute, recorder and cello, who, by their expressions, seem to suggest that the noise they're making is not entirely harmonious. And in place of Raphael's Euclid, demonstrating some proposition in geometry, we have the Scotsman Dr. Irwin, who Robert Adam remembers as having drunk 4 to 5 bottles of wine a day. However, here he seems to be more interested in how to divide the pie that a couple of dogs are sniffing hungrily. So for all Reynolds' admiration for Raphael, he wasn't above parodying him for a laugh. But a more serious threat to Raphael's reputation has come from someone else in the mid-19th century. John Ruskin. Ruskin didn't mince words. For Ruskin, Raphael had initiated the decline of art. First of all, with his lack of truth to nature, and second, with his corruption of pure Christian art with pagan imagery. Ruskin was appalled that in the same room in the Vatican, Raphael had painted on one wall theology, presided over by Christ, and near it, poetry presided over by Apollo. And he writes, "From that spot and from that hour, the intellect and art of Italy date their degradation." He criticized the infatuation with ideal beauty rather than with the natural world as it really was. And he took issue with the fact that students were encouraged to copy Raphael, and yet they were expected to be original. He writes again, "The clear and tasteless poison of the art of Raphael should be replaced by an art deriving from the unidealized portrayal of nature in its raw state, based on foundations established by Raphael's predecessors." For Ruskin, idealization was morally indefensible because it involved a lie. Ruskin instead championed the pre-Raphaelites, artists such as Millet, because of their commitment to realism, to representing the world with all its imperfections. I'm just showing you this. This is probably an unusual pre-Raphaelite picture. This severe, unemotional study of a mother and child is, as you can see, in sharp contrast to Raphael's idealized images of motherhood. They're shown on the wall behind Mrs. Wyatt. You know which one I prefer? So where's Raphael now? Well, he's not particularly fashionable, and he won't draw the same crowds to an exhibition as will Monet, or Leonardo, or Picasso. Fashionable or not, someone still thinks highly enough of him to have paid £26 million for this drawing last week. It's Raphael's Head of an Apostle, which was sold from Chatsworth, and is a study for the painting, the Transfiguration, for this figure here, which is the painting, of course, with which I started. Thank you.
So it's with real pleasure that I want to thank Professor Cassidy for a splendid talk. And instead of taking questions here, I'd like to invite you all back to the SCVA for a reception where you can speak with Professor Cassidy, also with a glass of wine, and we can have a toast to the season. So thank you very, very much.